Hello and welcome back. In this video we're just going to have a quick look at the files Pulumi created for us as part of our project, as well as install some VS Code extensions just to make the developer experience a little bit nicer for us. So why don't we start there? If you click on the extensions tab on the left hand side, and we're just going to search for C#. Now the extensions that you want to install are the C# base language support extension, C# dev kit, and IntelliCode for C#. So go ahead and install those now. And once they're done, we'll get into the files. Okay, so you should have those extensions installed. Come back up, click on Explorer on the left-hand side, and open pulumi.yaml. So pulumi.yaml is the first file we're going to look at. And basically, this is the configuration file for the project. You probably recognize some of the fields in here. On the first line, we've got the name of our project, which we called infrastructure. You could have called this whatever you wanted. It doesn't matter as long as you don't change it once you've created the project. If you put some resources into your cloud provider, so for example, if we make a virtual machine now and put it into Azure, and then we come and change this name, you're going to have a bad time. So don't do it. Create the project, name it, and deal with the fact that you've named it. The next one is the runtime. So we're going to run on .NET. If you're using TypeScript, this is going to say Node. If you're using Python, it's going to say Python 3. Again, don't change this. You don't need to. It's not going to help you. Just leave it as it is. On line 3, we've got the description. Again, we just left this at the default, so a minimal Azure native C# Pulumi program. You can change this one, and it's not going to make any difference. So we could just change this to Global Cycle Infrastructure, and our project would be absolutely fine. This one is more of a cue for other people who might be looking at your project to understand what it's actually about. I've never actually seen this used. It's always just a Pulumi minimal program for Azure Native. The next file is pulumi.dev.yaml. In the last video, we did create a stack called dev. If you didn't call yours dev and you called it bananas, then your file is going to say pulumi.bananas.yaml. And again, we'll talk about stacks in a future lesson. However, on line 1, we have an encryption salt. I didn't set a passphrase for my secrets. If you did, this is more important to you. But again, it's just one of those lines that you don't really need to touch or change. It will change itself if it needs to. And if you change it, you're going to have a bad time. So don't do it. Just leave it. And line 2 is the configuration object that is specific to our dev stack. So in our case, we only set the location, which is West Europe. You might have set this as West US 2 or North Europe. Again, it doesn't really matter as long as you know that that region exists in Azure. Okay, the last file we're going to look at is program.cs. The rest are created by C# and are not really important. We may come back and visit CS proj later, but for now we don't need to, so we'll just look at program.cs. Program.cs, for anyone not familiar with C#, is the entry point to any C# program. So it doesn't matter whether you're writing a console application, a web application, a web API, everything starts at program.cs, and it's no exception for Pulumi. So at the top of the file, we can see the libraries that we're using in this file. So we are using the Pulumi library, and as part of that, we're using Azure Native, which is the Azure provider for Pulumi. And then in Azure Native right now, it's using resources, storage inputs. And then the last one is a system library called collections.generic, which allows us to create things like dictionaries and lists. Again, if you're familiar with C#, this is nothing new to you. You're just using the libraries you would normally use when you're writing any C# program. So you would normally use system.collections.generic, for example, to create a list of objects. And to create a list of objects in Pulumi, you just create a list of objects as you would in any other C# program. That's the power of Pulumi. You can use any programming language, and anything you can do in that programming language, you can also do in Pulumi. And where it gets a little bit more interesting for us is from line 7. So line 7 is the start of the program. When we run Pulumi, this is the method that executes. And then from line 10, this is where we're actually defining our resources. So the first resource that we create is a resource group. And for those of you who don't know Azure, a resource group is basically like a container for other resources. So we're going to put things like a virtual machine into there, a virtual network, And basically all it allows us to do is inherit things like security permissions. And if we wanted to delete the whole thing, we could just delete the resource group and all the other resources would be deleted with it. Think of a resource group as a box, and in that box is where we're going to put all of the things that we want to create. Okay, so that's what line 10 does. It creates that resource group. And then line 13 all the way down basically creates a storage account. It then looks at the keys for that storage account and prints the primary key to the console. And all the primary key is the password basically, or the access key to that storage account. So if we then wanted to put some files in it or access it, we would use that key. And obviously we need to print that to the console to be able to use it. But we'll talk about secrets, outputs, and all of this stuff a lot more going forwards and in future lessons. For now, all you need to know, program.cs is where we start, and this is how we define our resources. Remember that Pulumi is declarative, which means that we're not saying this is how to create a resource group, this is how to create a storage account. We're saying, I want a resource group, I want to name it resource group, and it goes off and creates it. On line 13, we're saying, I want a storage account. I want to call it SA, and it goes off and it creates a storage account. Yes, we can provide it with more things. So here we're saying we want it to be locally redundant, so standard LRS, and we want it to be a V2 storage account, but we're not saying go to Azure, build a storage account, make it this. We're not telling it how to make that storage account. We're just saying, I want a storage account, and Pulumi is doing the rest for us. Okay, great. So that's the default project that Pulumi creates for us. And in the next video, we're going to start creating our own resources that fulfill the requirements for the GloboCycle project. I'll see you there.